Hello, everyone. My name is John Shea. I'm an undergraduate student at Grand Valley State University. And today I'm going to be talking about our research about environmental connectivity and how it influences the origination of adaptive processes. So understanding the origin of life requires us to understand how chemical systems came together to form systems capable of adaptive complexification. One hypothesis prior to that first genetic replicator was that these adaptive processes emerged in chemical reaction networks made up of interacting autocatalytic cycles. So it was then from this pre-genetic adaptive processes that could then drive a gradual transition to genetic replicators and then further to adaptive complexification via Darwinian evolution. Now, an autocatalytic cycle is just a group of chemicals that can collectively produce more of themselves via a series of reactions. So in this example, we see that chemical Z amplifies itself via a series of chemical reactions. So now we can think about these, the prebiotic chemical soup and these autocatalytic cycles through an ecological lens, where we see them analogous to a biological species. We can then further think about these networks of interacting autocatalytic cycles, quite like an ecological community. So this framing allows us to better study the origin of life and then finally ask, does spatial structure influence the origination of adaptive dynamics in these communities of ACs? And to do this, we use a computational model. In modeling these communities of autocatalytic cycles, we study the conditions under which adaptive processes are likely to emerge. For example, this is just an example location in our world simulation, but in individual shapes are the autocatalytic cycles. And during the simulation, these autocatalytic cycles can do three different things or three different processes, where the first is they can interact with each other and affect each other's abundance, as defined by an interaction matrix. So for this example, we see that the triangles are going to benefit the growth of the circles, and then the circles are a little bit detrimental on the other, on the opposite side to the triangles. So in the next time step, we're going to see that the circles have taken over the spot. Now the ACs can also seed randomly into new locations from various spots in the world. And in the next slide, we're going to see a pink triangle return to this spot, quite like this, and it has been seeded back. And because this world is comprised of many local patches, the way that these autocatalytic cycles can traverse the space is by diffusing into adjacent cells. And then after running 20,000 updates of these interactions, seeding, and diffusion, we then take the final distribution of these autocatalytic cycles and then in each location, where we're able to measure the adaptiveness exhibited by these communities of interacting autocatalytic cycles. And to do this, we compare them to two null models, one being of a purely adaptive system, and then one being of an ecological system. And looking specifically at the ecological null model that we use, this is the less adaptive, or the less evidence of adaptiveness. In this, the ACs can interact, and the only way that they can traverse the space is by seeding. And there's no diffusion to these connected locations. And the adaptive null model, which we're looking for, where there's more evidence of adaptiveness, it's very similar to an ecological null model, all except that these ACs can reproduce as a single unit, quite like a genetic replicator into adjacent locations. And then when we're measuring these spatial structures, we used a well-mixed shape, which is, or a fully connected graph, because it doesn't particularly have spatial structure, and we compared that to other structures that are more structured, quite like a linear chain. And we compared the emergence of adaptive dynamics across 10 connectivity patterns, as found commonly in literature that we see here now. Things like a star or toroidal lattice. And our results showed that spatial structure does in fact influence the emergence of adaptive dynamics. So now I'm going to explain this particular experiment before we get into our greater results. So on that left-hand side, you guys will see the spatial structure name, and on the bottom, you'll see the adaptiveness score. That red vertical line is our 0 value for adaptiveness. So those values found on the left-hand side of that are considered to be more of an ecological system, and those values on the right-hand side are considered to be a more adaptive system. You also see a dashed vertical line, which is our median score for that well-mixed. This is actually, we use this to categorize each of the spatial structures as to whether they were suppressors of adaptive dynamics. So whether that score was less than the well-mixed, it was considered a suppressor. Whether it was an amplifier of adaptive dynamics, whether that adaptiveness score was greater than the well-mixed. And if there was no statistical significance, then it was considered neither. And so for this example, we see that spatial structure, the spatial structures here behave more like amplifiers relative to that control. And now I'm going to explain that interaction matrix, which we talked about previously. This is made up of varying degrees of connectance and positive interaction proportion. So for this experiment that I was pointing out, 25% of those AC interactions are positive. So they're promoting growth. And then there's a low, the connectance, there's a low density of those interactions among those ACs, as there's a score of 0.25. So then if we change these properties, then we're going to see the full impact of spatial structure in this next slide, where we see that the role of spatial structure depends on these properties of AC interactions. And then looking at this figure, I'll talk through it. As from left to right, we see the proportion, the positive proportion of positive interaction increase from left to right. And then from top to bottom, we see that density of connection increase. And we can make this statement as we see that the star graph acts as an amplifier in the top left, and we see it act as a suppressor in the top right panel. And this also allowed us to count and classify each of these spatial structures as to whether they were amplifiers or suppressors. And we found that for at least one of these AC community types, each structure acted as either an amplifier or a suppressor. And again, those are just definitions there on the right. So in conclusion, we found that each pattern of these environmental connectivities each pattern of environmental connectivity can influence the emergence of adaptive dynamics in a simulated system, and the effect of spatial structure varies across these community types. Each structure acted as an amplifier or suppressor at least once, and that we found that there may be no single environment that universally promotes the origination of adaptive dynamics and is therefore dependent on its system. And while in our paper, we also screened for graph properties that correlated with these adaptiveness scores, I'm willing to talk a little bit about those, but please refer to our paper if you'd like to know more. In terms of future work, we're looking to do case studies on selected replicates, visualize how different connectivity patterns influence community diffusion, and design specific spatial structures that either amplify or suppress adaptive dynamics, using those graph properties that we found to be strongly correlated with those adaptiveness scores. Now, I'd love to make some acknowledgements, as I wouldn't be standing here today without my supporters for facilitating